Just can I on Eastern Central Europe, but really more in Russia. Uh, a lot of the big foundations went in there in the 90s for a variety of reasons. One, restore capitalism. Two, fix the prison system. A lot of these sort of things. And they did this. They did their act as you'd expect with that kind of money and that sort of heady moment. They were going to sort of turn all these things around. That had taken years to develop, plus the sort of autocratic slash authoritarian issue, so germane to Russian history. So our approach really was on the civil society approach, but especially those institutions, organizations, although this was a little bit of a problem also if they weren't one of the four major religions, Islam, Orthodoxy, Judaism, or Catholicism, was to go that route, because that was, of course, the strength of the dissident movement, especially the Catholics and Lutherans in Central and Eastern Europe, not so much in Russia. And so for those big foundations, as you describe them as managerial problem solvers with big money and all good intentions and self-blessed with good intentions, that the best way was going that route. And it worked for the first few years in terms of getting some cover. But of course, being realistic about it, even in those circumstances, are very difficult, especially within Russia, very difficult prospect. But I just wanted to sort of support your definitional issue on the managerial class and a sort of almost a knee-jerk reaction, or beyond that, a sort of robotic reaction in terms of managing problems and keeping problems alive. And in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, it wasn't certainly the right climate for that kind of heady optimism.
Well, I mean, the one interesting thing that's connected here and is related to the parallel polis that I know you want to talk about, Mike, the communist regime was a managerial regime. The idea was basically to manage everything from the top down, right? And one thing managerial regimes do is they, in part deliberately, in part just because it's what they do, they destroy the intermediary community organizations and institutions that exist between the individual and the state. So all these Tocquevillian associations and institutions that are sort of created from the bottom up by people to solve their problems, sort of the fabric of democracy. The managerial regime sort of can't stand those, and it can't stand them because it wants to manage everything. So, and it thinks it can manage better than these organic, messy organizations. So it tends to sort of slowly wipe them out or dissolve them. And in the case of communism, to an extreme degree, even trying to break apart the family unit, for example, because that's sort of the original intermediary institution. And so, after communism, there was basically none of those organic institutions left. So you had the state, and you had the individuals, and you had these state companies, and basically nothing else. And so in many places it was sort of a disaster where, you can come in as a foundation and try to build things, but you're going to end up, building them from the top down again, rather than, unless you have an explicit mission to help people build from the bottom up. And the remarkable thing about the parallel polis, which was, to get into that, in Czechoslovakia under communism, the dissidents there made an explicit decision to build institutions and communities and associations underground, specifically as a means to resist communism by creating those very institutions that the communists most hated, which was these organizing outside of the Communist Party. And the idea was to combat the atomization, isolation, demoralization that the communist regime was creating. And so they built this whole network of underground institutions. They built underground universities, philosophy seminars, magazines, theater productions, mutual aid societies to sort of help those that were being persecuted by the state. So effectively an underground economy. And this was very effective. But it wasn't just because they're sort of building up, keeping each other's spirits up. They're sort of building underground institutions and networks that were resilient. And what they essentially did was creating a parallel state. And so in Czechoslovakia, when communism collapsed, unlike in Russia, for example, the transition to democracy ended up much better. And it went much better because the parallel polis became, the parallel state became the state. The same people that were running the underground parallel polis, like Václav Havel, literally becomes in charge of the state. So much of the chaos that happened in some place like Russia was avoided because those institutions had already been built well before the collapse of the state that happened to happen.
Was the parallel in Czechoslovakia, was it political from the start? Sort of, did it have a political aim?
Well, yes and no. I mean, this is an interesting question because on one hand, in the Czechoslovakian case, it was political in the sense that it was intended to resist totalitarianism. So you could call it political. But on the other hand, it was not, it wasn't trying to advance a policy agenda. It wasn't holding protests. They weren't trying to get the state to do anything. They just wanted to be left alone, right? And so on the one hand, if you build a parallel polis, you're sort of abandoning politics. You're going outside of politics. You are going back to the grassroots level and sort of building things for yourself because you're dissatisfied with the government. So do you call that political? It's sort of pre-political. But then on the other hand, these organizations are inherently political, I would say, because they're what you're doing is you're winning grassroots legitimacy and loyalty from people for solving their problems. Even if this isn't like as part of a political project, that is very threatening to the regime because you are building political power in its original sense of sort of you do things for people. And so they view you as more legitimate than, if they turn to you for things that they need, then you are sort of the illegitimate state to them, or at least more so than the state, more relevant to them. Yeah. And so parallel organizing really is how mass movements are created in general. They don't always lead there. They aren't always intended to do that, but they can do that. And so I'd say, yes, they are often inherently political.
Yeah. I think Mike Joyce at Bradley, Dan, or maybe you, Dan, or maybe Bill Shamber. I remember hearing as a new Bradley program officer, charity is subversive of the state.
Well, yeah, and the toughest place for us was Western Ukraine. We worked there with the Catholic University, which was a theological academy in long ago days. But of course, the Ukrainians have all kinds of problems currently as well as then. But that was the idea that it wasn't a political, we were looking at education and journalism and helping the disabled. And it sort of revolved around the Greek Catholic Church, which of course presented a political issue for the Russian Orthodox Church and thereby created a problem for the Russian government. So
even today in places like Russia or China, I mean, they're extremely sensitive about allowing NGOs to operate in countries. And sort of for good reason, actually. I mean, we see in our country, we were just talking about, the role of NGOs in politics. And I think it's because these are, in a sense, political organizations. They do things at the political level, even if they don't intend to.
No, you're exactly right.
Threatening.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned theater groups we had supported in Belarus, Tom Stoppard's group. And that was a difficult pull as well in Belarus because of the government there, which was really essentially the Russians. And but that was and sort of your crossover, as you're explaining, it's sort of a political small p, but with a powerful, very powerful, what can we say, creative inspiration and Stoppard and his support as well. So it fulfilled a lot of purposes, but a very difficult, let's say, violent reaction to it as an NGO.
Right.
Does America need a parallel polis? This is maybe the final question. It's a two-parter. I'm putting the ball on the tee for you here. Does America need a parallel polis, and might it already have one?
Well, I think it does. I mean, I think that the managerial regime, let's call it, as we've discussed before, and by that I don't mean just the government and its bureaucracies, but also the foundations, the nonprofits, the universities, the media, the corporations, now sort of all move in lockstep because they're all networked together and they all have the same interests. And so it's very difficult to challenge that. And I mean, Donald Trump, for instance, found this out in his first administration that, you can literally be the president, you'd have control of the White House, and theoretically you control the executive branch, but what he started calling the deep state, is the managerial regime that even if it is not a conspiracy against the president or something like that, it's just that all these institutions move together and they resent any resistance to them. So it's going to be very difficult to create any change, even through democratic politics. I mean, the whole system sort of has evolved itself to avoid democratic accountability, to resist any change by the ballot box. And I mean, I think people have experienced that they'll say things like who they vote for doesn't matter because nothing ever changes. And I think to some degree that's true because the managerial regime is not responsive to politics. To electoral politics, I mean. And so, this is very hard for the American people to vote themselves out of because it's a structural problem. So I think they would be much better off essentially going back to the grassroots level, building resilient alternative sources of community legitimacy and power, that can solve problems that they want to be solved. And the best way to do that is through parallel organizing.
And could one look, I'm asking the Bill Shambra, making the point, asking the question, does it need to be newly created, or could one look to existing places in America to include central cities? And by the way, maybe unorthodox allies for a conservative.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of these organizations already exist. I mean, there's people already all over America who have seen challenges in their communities and have come together to create organizations, formally or informally, that try to solve those problems. And I mean, you can think of those as the same kind of organizing as what I'm talking about. So, for example, Bill mentioned in his talk, members of the African American community in the city who are trying to solve various problems from the bottom up, and often successfully, sometimes not. So do these organizations, does the parallel polis already exist? I'd say partially, because the organizing is there, it's happening, but it's not networked, it's not united. And I think to really have an effective parallel polis, it needs to be united in some way, if not coordinated, from the top down, then at least, be working towards essentially the same broader vision. And so I think that's what's lacking in the United States in part. Obviously, I think we probably need other new institutions to be built as well, in addition to what's happening already. But I think that probably the first step in trying to really do something like this here would be identifying, and bringing together all these existing efforts, and bringing them, networking them together so that they can really, have that power of unity, instead of just all working on their own, unaware of the existence of others.
Mm-hmm. And to bring it back, this really is my final, to bring it back to conservative philanthropy, which is outnumbered by the progressive, philanthropically supported managerial,
Right.
is what role could conservative philanthropy play here in finding, creating, improving, nourishing, strengthening a good, healthy parallel polis in America?
Well, I think it's what I just mentioned about playing a unifying role, a coordinating and networking role. So I think that trying to map these existing organizations, or to sort of set up a central hub where they can come together, and talk with each other and talk to new funders and so on, and organize themselves in a broader movement. I think that is essentially what is needed. So if any conservative philanthropists want to set that up, I think that would be the ideal road to take.